Good morning, everyone. My name is Marcia Nedland, and I'm one of the organizers for the National Middle Neighborhoods Community of Practice. We're just going to take a couple of minutes and let all the attendees join the call. Meanwhile, it would be great if you typed into the chat where you're tuning in from. So we know, sort of the geography of folks that are checking in. A lot of our panelists know something about many other states besides the one that they live in. I'll start tuning in from Tucson, Arizona. All right, Brattleboro, Vermont. Hi, everyone. If you didn't hear me talk before, this is Marcia Nedland. I'm one of the organizers for the National Middle Neighborhoods Community of Practice. We're just letting everyone come into the room and would love to have you type into the chat where you're tuning in from. Fair Housing Center in Cleveland. I'm really glad you're here. I love Fair Housing Center folks. New Brunswick, New Jersey. That's a place I've not been. Oh, we've got another one. Indianapolis. I've been to the Fraser neighborhood in Dallas. Hi, Fraser Revitalization. And is that Felicia? Oh, it's Felisa. Hi, Felisa. Nadine, okay. Oh, hey, April from FDIC. Hi, everyone. We're just letting everyone come into the room. Please type into the chat where you're tuning in from. Okay, it seems like maybe we've leveled off a little. I'll go ahead. We'll go ahead and get started with my couple of opening slides. And then by the time we get to the stars of the show today, probably we'll have the rest of our attendees. So welcome again. Today, we're going to be talking about strategies to address institutional investors in middle neighborhoods. And I was just checking my files, and we had many people from this same team with us to do a webinar back in November. Doesn't seem that long ago, but it was November, I think, talking about the work they'd done, the work they were doing in researching what was going on with investors in the greater Cleveland area. And subsequently, they have written their report, not only on what they found, but on the strategies that they're recommending. And so today we wanted to have them back and talk about those strategies, because I think an awful lot of them are replicable, some of them right away in some places, others, we certainly have the expertise here to let people know when it's an issue at the state level that you have to deal with, or when it's a local thing you can deal with. We have an amazing team here. It's a lot of people who are from the VAPAC group. I'll let them tell you more about that, but go ahead and go to the next slide, Ann. So just one slide on the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative. We're sponsoring this webinar today. So it's a national initiative, and it's focused on mobilizing attention on middle neighborhoods, which we have observed are disappearing in great numbers, either through decline because no one's paying attention to their gradual loss of homeownership and oftentimes value, or through gentrification, especially very recently, as prices have gone crazy in many, many, many markets, most markets, in fact, in ways that are really surprising. So because most people sort of saw them as being on autopilot, there haven't been a lot of strategies devoted to them. The Middle Neighborhoods Initiative is a joint venture by the National Community Stabilization Trust and NeighborWorks America. We have a steering committee, and we do a community of practice, which is what's sponsoring this webinar. We'd love to have you join us in the community of practice. We do research, policy analysis, and communication. So go ahead. So about middle neighborhoods, what we mean when we talk about middles are really those neighborhoods that are neither your most distressed neighborhoods nor are they your most healthy neighborhoods. They tended to have been built mostly as single family neighborhoods for families with children. They tend to still be well more than 50% owner occupied, but have been slowly eroding over time and perhaps rapidly eroding in very recent years because of the topic we're talking about today. The housing stock is aging. It tends to be in more acceptable condition than in more distressed neighborhoods, but has the challenge of having some features that don't match what today's home buyers are interested in, like having only one bath, or certain features that need to be really updated to make them work for today's home buyers. One of the things that are really interesting about middle neighborhoods is that they tend to be more diverse than either their lower income or higher income counterparts. And I mean that diverse economically as well as racially and ethnically. So today's panel, let's get right to it. Frank Ford knows everything about vacant properties and investors. And I don't know, he's had so many jobs just in the last year alone, right, Frank? That it gives him a lot of experience. I'm teasing, but he's a senior policy advisor right now for the Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research. And he's been the chair of the VAPAC committee that's been researching these issues and has published this report. Tim Kobe is the business process analyst for the city of Cleveland and has done all of the really in-depth nitty-gritty research to understand exactly what the parameters of the problem and the situation are in Cleveland Metro. Jamie Lucas Bauer is a community development specialist for the state of Vermont, but she was for many years the neighborhood development project manager at Old Brooklyn CDC in Cleveland. And she has really very fascinating on the ground stories about figuring out what investors were doing in her neighborhood. Sally Martin is the director of building and housing for the city of Cleveland. And many of you may know her as being recently the director of housing for the city of South Euclid, is how I first met her. So she's experienced this both as a South Euclid city person and now for the city of Cleveland. And Zach is director of neighborhood stabilization for Slavic Village Development, another neighborhood in Cleveland. Also has, he's also a lawyer, and he's gonna have to leave us at some point to go to court. So we know he's really working all the angles here, but he'll be giving us some of the legal recommendations moving forward. So we're gonna try and hold questions until the end, but you can certainly type them into the chat or the Q&A. And I'm gonna hand things over to Frank to get us started.
Thank you. So basically what we're going to be focusing on is this report that we produced in March called The Impact of Real Estate Investor Activity on the Cuyahoga County Housing Market. And that it was produced by the Vacant and Abandoned Property Action Council. Everybody just refers to that as VAPAC. VAPAC started in 2005, focused almost exclusively on just vacant and abandoned property. Over the last 17 years, the mission has expanded to look more broadly at anything that might lead to vacancy, abandonment, distress, destabilization of neighborhoods and inner-ring suburbs in Cuyahoga County. Next slide. So VAPAC created an investor working group about 4 years ago to investigate real estate investors engaged in practices undermining housing markets and destabilizing communities. In October 2020, Tim Kobe, PhD, and with the City of Cleveland, began an analysis of investor activity. In his spare time, I should say, we're so glad that he took this on. And then in March of this year, based on the work of Dr. Kobe and the working group's investigation, we published this report. And I've got the link there in case people want to see it. The following presentation will highlight key findings and recommendations. Next slide. So this is something that we've been including whenever we do this presentation. And because we got some criticism right off the bat, as soon as this was widely published in news media, that we were attacking all investors. And that is actually not true. We certainly acknowledge there are many responsible investors in Cleveland and in the county. And our work was not aimed at those investors. We were looking at those who are engaged in non-compliance with laws, other irresponsible activity, which not only harms communities, but diminishes the reputation of the many investors who are complying with laws and acting responsibly. Next slide. I want to take a moment and talk about institutional investor. It is a term which has captured the attention of a lot of people. It's in national news media. In fact, I believe this webinar is referred to as a webinar on institutional investors. I do want to point out, though, that in our work, we didn't make that distinction. And you know, I've cited one article here that might be worth looking at in the first paragraph that did report that large corporate entities that hold tens of thousands of units. I think that the original concept of using the term institutional investor as it emerged over the last 5 to 10 years was in reference to large mega corporations like Blackstone that did own tens of thousands of units. More recently, a study by the National Association of Realtors found that institutional investors were 13% of all residential purchases in 2021. Now, that is significant, but it's worth noting that the researchers in this study defined institutional investor as any company, LLC, corporation, without regard to size of the company. So I think you really have to be careful about this. I didn't put this in the slide, but I was at a meeting recently where someone reported that Freddie Mac has done a study, and I've not been able to find it yet, where they concluded that the genuine sort of pure institutional investors are only about 1 to 2% of the inventory, not the 13% represented by the second paragraph. In any case, the term investor is used 186 times in our study. We use institutional investor once. In our conversations and our meetings locally, we rarely ever talk about institutional investors. The research we've done suggests that the problems we're seeing are not, at least on the surface, coming from these mega corporations that own tens of thousands of units. The research suggests the problems are coming from small and medium investors who may own less than 100 properties. They may own 20 or 30 properties. And the bottom line here, of course, is that each community, and I know there are many, I looked at the list of people that registered. You've got something like 30 different states registered for this session today. Every community really is going to need to look at their own, what's going on in their own community. Is it single family? Is it multifamily? Who are these investors? We are doing some follow-up research on the investors to see it's possible that some of the large mega investors are forming companies that are doing less than 100 properties. My personal opinion is, just from the research I've done so far, is that that really isn't the case. I just think this is still small investors, small meaning 100 properties, 200 properties, 50 properties, not 10,000. Anyway, the recommendations we're going to be getting into, I think, could apply regardless of size. Next slide. 6 key findings, and I'm going to go through these very quickly because the subsequent slides are going to go into this in more detail. Between 2004 and 2020, investor buying activity dramatically increased in Cuyahoga County. You know, one more thing, let me back up and say, maybe I implied this, but I didn't say it explicitly. We also defined investor as a business owner, any LLC with INC in the name, partnership, LLC. We didn't make a distinction between whether the business owned 10,000, 5,000, 100. how many properties. So any LLC was included. But that investor activity increased dramatically in Cuyahoga County in that time period. The greatest increase was in the east side of Cleveland, which is our largest, our region with the largest concentration of African American population. Second finding, increased buying of homes by investors has meant fewer homes on the market for affordable home ownership, and we will demonstrate that a little bit later. Investors tend to be buying homes at the bottom of the market at discounted prices. Next slide. Investors buying homes in the east side of Cleveland are pulling permits for renovation, repair, and maintenance at a lower rate than investors buying homes in white neighborhoods in the west side of Cleveland. An increase of homes without permits, meaning either no repairs or illegal repairs, results in lower quality housing for renters, and at the same time reduces home values for neighborhood homeowners adjacent. Investor activity aggravates the appraisal gap problem. In distressed markets, responsible community developers wanting to do a sustainable level of rehab for homeownership will end up with an appraisal gap, will often end up with an appraisal gap. And I'm sure that's something that many of the members of this practitioner group will be familiar with. And they can't compete with irresponsible investors who are willing to do little or no repairs on a rental property. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over at this point. You can actually go to the next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kobe, who really led the research effort, and let him talk about the analysis. Tim?
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on your time zone. So we can actually go to the next slide so everybody can have an opportunity to kind of take in what the chart is showing us. But when I started doing the research, what we were concerned about is we were seeing what we thought was more investor activity in Cuyahoga County and in Cleveland, but we didn't really have any good data to back that up. So we wanted to have some numbers to kind of back up what we were seeing, and just kind of make sure that it wasn't because we were dealing with problem owners more frequently just because of our job descriptions, that we were maybe too focused in on this. So to help us get a handle on the scale of the problem, I went ahead and looked at property transactions, and then I looked at who was acquiring the property. And I think there were like 7 different categories in the study that I looked at, but the focus was really on the difference between businesses and individuals. And I went back to 2004 so that way we could kind of look what happened through the foreclosure crisis. I thought that'd give us a good idea of what might be like a high number for investor activity versus a low number. And you can see that in the chart. Go back to 2004, and then as we head into the foreclosure crisis, we see a rise in investor activity in Cleveland and in the east inner suburbs. The 2 lines at the bottom are the west inner suburbs and the outer suburbs, and you don't really see an increase in investor activity during the foreclosure crisis here. Those are just areas that weren't as hard hit as other submarkets in Cuyahoga County. And then after the foreclosure crisis, you kind of see like a cooling down, or at least what I'll call a pause in increased investor activity. And then in 2012, we see this rise in investor activity across every single submarket. So even the outer suburbs and the west inner suburbs saw this increase. But as Frank already mentioned, the biggest increase was the east side of Cleveland. It went from less than 20% to over 45% of transactions were going to businesses. And also, as Frank mentioned, this is one of our submarkets. It's over 80% African American. The other submarket that saw the biggest increase after that is the east inner suburbs. So they were down, 17% or so, and they ended up being just under 30% increase from 2012 to 2020. And the east inner suburbs, I forget what the exact number is, but they're majority African American as well. So when you think about how, so we're not talking cause and effect here necessarily, but what we are saying is that investor activity is impacting African American neighborhoods at a greater rate than it is for white neighborhoods. And then, so one more thing on this slide, I think, and we talked about home ownership opportunities. The east side of Cleveland, west side of Cleveland, east inner suburbs, these were typically what you would consider affordable neighborhoods for home ownership. These were the spots where your first time home buyers would look to buy a home. And what we're seeing here now, and the data here is from 2020, but we're seeing similar patterns in 2021 and 2022. First time home buyers, they're now having to compete with investors at an increased rate. So on the east side of Cleveland, actually investors acquired property more often than an individual buyer did. So when you're thinking you have to go, if you're a first time home buyer, you get proof for your loan, you look at a house, you want to do your inspection, you want to do your due diligence. And then you have investors coming in who are paying cash, don't care about an inspection, don't care about any other contingencies. It's really hard for our first time home buyers to compete in these neighborhoods. So that was one thing that kind of stood out for me from this slide. And I was also concerned, what other things might be happening related to investor activity. So we can go to the next slide. And one of the big things that we were hearing in the VAPAC group was that investors are buying property and then they're not taking care of it. They're not fixing it up. They're not making repairs. They're not complying with city ordinances. And to do that, I took 2 years, 2018 and 2019, and I looked at building permit data. And you can see the results here. I looked to see who was pulling permits after they purchased the property. And on the west side of Cleveland, businesses were pulling permits about 12% of the time for any construction permit. And then you can see the other three groups, buyers on the east side and then individuals on the west side, they were pulling permits about 9% of the time. But what stands out, and I don't think the slide is in here, but it is in the report for those of you who have already read it or are going to work through it. The quality of the housing stock is actually less on the east side of Cleveland. So it was interesting that we have a higher percentage of permits pulled on the west side when you would really expect a higher percentage of permits to be pulled on the east side. And what happens when we remove, when we look at only building permits, so when I take out electrical, mechanical, those types of permits, plumbing permits, and focus only on building permits. So these are your bigger projects, your roofs, your kitchen rehabs, any bigger project. When I look only at those permits, you can see that business buyers and individual buyers on the west side were pulling permits at a higher rate than those on the east side. And again, based on the quality of the housing stock, the data that we have on that, we would actually expect to see this to be flipped. And I put the map in there to just really show the visual of where the permit activity is happening. It's the near west side, a little bit in Old Brooklyn, a little bit in Cams and West Park area. Then there's very little building permit activity on the east side of Cleveland. Lee Harvard stands out as a little bit of activity there. And then I think there was a project that happened in the Glenville neighborhood, Circle North, and that's why you see that there. So when we're looking at investor activity, and Frank mentioned it, like we have a lot of good investors, but there are patterns of behavior that we're seeing that lead us to believe that there are going to be negative impacts for tenants, for neighbors, and for communities at large based on this smaller subset of investors who are not investing in property. They're actually just holding the property, and I think Jamie likes to say they extract instead of being an investor. And they're going to get more into this here in a little bit, but that's just kind of touching on some of the data that we have. And I think we're going to go back to Frank now.
Next slide. So, question is, so why is this happening? Why are investors increasing their activity in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County? There's an interesting quote here. It was relayed to housing practitioners at a meeting in 2021 by a licensed appraiser who was commissioned by the city of Cleveland to do a study. And as part of her study, she interviewed some investors. She wasn't looking for this quote, But the quote is fascinating. It said, the streets in Cleveland are paved in platinum because the houses are so cheap and the rents never declined. What they mean by never declined, meaning during the foreclosure crisis, in fact, actually, we could go to the next slide. This will be an illustration. So this is 13 east side of Cleveland neighborhoods that were the hardest hit by subprime and predatory lending and had the steepest drop in home sale prices during the foreclosure crisis. And what's fascinating about this, if you look at the far right, 2021, you've got the top three neighborhoods, the red, green, and sort of a darker green. Even those top three are only at like 60, 70, 75,000. When you look at the bulk of the neighborhoods on the east side, they're down at the $45,000 to $25,000 range in median home sale price. And that's recovery. That's, you can see the upward swing. So the good news is that these prices are actually moving upward, but it means that if you bought a home, if you were an African-American home buyer and you bought your home in 2005, your home is worth nowhere near what it was when you bought it. But think of now the rents. So these are the low prices that are attracting investors to buy homes for cash, 20, 30,000, 40,000. And the rents they're collecting are at that high end. They're whatever they were back in 2005. The foreclosure crisis didn't cause any decline in rents in these neighborhoods, just decline in the prices. So that takes us back to, it may not be the only thing that is driving this activity, but it's pretty clear that investors see a community like Cleveland, this scenario is a big win for them because they can buy cheaply and the revenue they're going to collect is way out of proportion for what they're paying for the property. The next slide. Fewer homes on the market for home buyers. We mentioned that as one of the findings. Go to the next slide. So what was done here is comparing the red bars are 1 to 3 family home sales in Cuyahoga County in 2020. The light green bars are 1 to 4 family mortgage loans from the home mortgage lending HMDA data. Now, 1 to 3 family, 1 to 4 family may not sound like apples to apples, but it is actually because 99% of all transactions in the county are really 1 to 2 family. So the difference between the 3 and the 4 family is statistically insignificant. But notice what is revealed here, that in the outer suburbs on the left, the west inner suburbs, these are predominantly white communities, and the west side of Cleveland, you've at least got more parity that when there's a transaction, a sale taking place, there's more likely to be a mortgage. If you go all the way to the far right, on the east side of Cleveland, where we have this heaviest investor activity, we didn't have an insignificant number of sales. We had 3,500, which is significant, but we only had 650 mortgages in that same year. Only 18% of the sales were associated with a mortgage. So this suggests a couple things. First of all, of course, it does suggest, at least our conclusion is, a high degree of investor activity where investors are paying cash. They don't need to be borrowing from KeyBank or Chase or whoever. They're either paying cash or they're using a non-traditional hard money lender. The other thing it suggests is that it's a seriously missed opportunity for affordable home ownership and a significant unmet mortgage credit need. Next slide. And I'm going to turn this over now to Zach, who's going to do recommendations 1, 2, and 3, and then Sally's going to do 4, 5, and 6. Zach?
Thanks, Frank. And also a happy morning and or afternoon to folks joining us, depending on your time zone. And I do want to also thank Frank and Marcia and Anne for allowing me to go first. As was mentioned, I am due in court in about an hour, actually talking about the first recommendation. Just Thankfully the court hearing's over Zoom, so I just have to shift my screen a little bit. Isn't technology great? But in general, I think one of the reasons for my involvement on this panel, and with VAPAC in particular, is that, as was mentioned in my brief bio, as a housing and urban development attorney, I am one of the folks, at least in our area, that is involved with the front line, boots on the ground, house by house, individual cases, and have really spent probably about the last 10 years or so working in the Slavic Village neighborhood on a very specific strategy. We call it our neighborhood stabilization plan. And just to kind of give you an idea of how that plan has been successful, when I started working in Slavic Village had the highest rate of home foreclosure in the country between 2007 and 2009. I started working there in 2013 after a 2-year fellowship at Cleveland Marshall College of Law's Urban Development Law Clinic, where I was under the tutelage of Professor Kermit Lind and also Carol Hayward. Some of the folks, particularly from Ohio, might know those names, but if you don't, highly recommend looking at their work in this area. When I started in Slavic Village, our vacancy rate was approaching 20%, and we had over 1,000 severely distressed properties, properties that were in various stages of condemnation, many properties that unfortunately were not able to be saved. I'm happy to say now that after 10 years working on our plan, that number is down to 1%, and I have less than 100 severely distressed properties in the Slavic Village service area. So let's just use that as proof of concept here. The reason that we were able to move those numbers in that direction was that we kind of exited the insanity loop. And I say that because one of the most common definitions of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And the thing that I noticed when I began my work at Slavic Village was that we were doing the same thing over and over again. We were just referring everything. We were referring everything to the city and expecting a small, overworked, underpaid staff of building inspectors to just churn through mountains of increasingly complex and complicated real estate schemes that emerged. One of the prior slides that Dr. Kobe shared was, that after the real high point of the recession, that's really when we started to see a lot of our investor activity really begin to skyrocket. And these are quite sophisticated schemes. They are involving, kind of an intersection between property law and corporate law. And unfortunately, if there's one thing that the average municipal code, remember, this is municipal level, not necessarily state level, but if there's one thing that the average municipal code is really not designed to do, is white collar crime, right? White collar crime, that's typically kind of upper level. We're talking state AGs, we're talking federal government. Typically, a local municipal code is not really designed to, in a criminal context, deal with the kinds of kind of gray area. Maybe it's legal, maybe it's not. We don't know. We've never seen a triple shell LLC before. We don't know who to charge. And essentially, that created a great deal of, I don't know if chaos is too strong a word to use, but certainly we had a situation where if we were looking at code enforcement and accountability processes as a cat and mouse game, the city's building department being the cat and these various investor schemes being the mice were certainly winning. And the way that, you know, you catch a mouse is you build a better mousetrap. And that's something that really involves using the civil law as opposed to purely relying on criminal components. I did see some colleagues from Columbus here, Deji Valentine. I wanted to say at the outset, I think that the city of Columbus, particularly for the state of Ohio, has really figured that out. And the reason that I am extolling that is that when one size fits all, right? When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if there are any fellow attorneys on the line here, when we're talking about property and we're talking about property conditions, you know, this is not 10,000 widgets. Every property is unique. It's like a fingerprint. It has its own unique title history. It has its own unique ownership. It has its own unique issues of disrepair or what have you. So if all we have is a hammer, that really starts to, you know, lead us to diminishing returns. By contrast, the civil law approach, or being able to have the flexibility between criminal and civil law approaches, allows whomever is seeking to hold what we would call a bad actor, right? If you're seeking to hold that bad actor accountable, you now have greater flexibility in what tools you're able to use to hold that actor accountable. Let me give you an example. Typically, and I think there are some building code officials here, perhaps you know, from other parts of the country. Are your building code citations felonies or misdemeanors? That's a very important question, because if they're misdemeanors, that means that you really don't have any jurisdiction outside of your local city. And, you know, certainly we don't want to say that, you know, Ms. Mabel, who's 86 years old and needs some help on her roof, do we want to charge her as a felon? No, we don't. So if we're going to hold to, you know, keeping building code citations at the misdemeanor level, well, all I need to really do to effectively not be held accountable is incorporate my LLC outside of your jurisdiction. So I can sit on my yacht in Palm Beach. No offense if there's anyone from Palm Beach on here. I can sit on my yacht and I can create a web of LLCs in Ohio. Costs $99 a pop, minimal disclosures. And I can own property in Slavic Village, and you can cite me up and down. You can, you know, haul me. Well, yeah, you can try to haul me into court because I'm an LLC and you can't arrest me, and I don't live in your jurisdiction, which means that there's no power of extradition on a misdemeanor. So I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing, and you're not going to be able to stop me. That is fundamentally what can happen when we're only relying on a certain set of remedies. Civil law, by contrast, right? Because I'm not trying to impinge on your liberty interest. I just want you to correct the dang thing. Civil law, I file a complaint, you don't answer. I serve you by publication. You have 28 days. If you don't make it, I get a default judgment. Simple as that. I don't care where you live. I get a default judgment. I get a court order. I can go in and I can make corrections to the property. And then as a kicker, I can add those costs to your tax bill, and then I can foreclose on you. Much simpler than having to go through the whole Fourth Amendment, Sixth Amendment rights, you know, of the accused in a building code context, you know, the right to cross-examination, innocence until proven guilty. I'm sorry, it's a strict liability offense. The property is either up to code or it's not. That's pretty much the long and short of it. So, like, for example, the case that I'm doing in about a half hour or so is a receivership. Ohio law, and this may be true in other jurisdictions as well, Ohio law allows for certain parties with standing. That includes a city. It also includes a neighborhood development corporation, community development corporation, or a neighbor within 500 feet. You would have standing to sue the owner of a distressed property. I mean, it has to be distressed. I mean, the evidentiary burden is not, you don't like the color of their drapes. I mean, we're talking serious disrepair. You can sue them. You can have the property declared a nuisance, and then you can have the court appoint a receiver to make those repairs. So that is one strategy that some jurisdictions have used. Obviously, we've used it to great effect in Slavic Village. That's, I think, one of the reasons why we've seen such a precipitous drop. But I also think that alone, there are no silver bullets here. There are no silver bullets. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir in some respect, that in addition to having civil remedies, there's also the issue of chewing this problem at the front end. And that's really where we need to talk about. What we're basically talking about is sunshine. We need sunshine, right? And the best way to get sunshine is when we have things like disclosures and transparencies, because it's maybe a cynical statement, but I will use it here because it's apt. And that is, look, if you're not doing anything wrong, you don't have anything to hide. And when we adapt that to a kind of a property, a real estate context, look, as was stated at the outset of this presentation, there are many honest investors that are really, many of them are contractors themselves. They love to do rehab projects, and they really, there's a certain pride in, helping someone find a place to live and owning. That's all well and good. And those folks, by and large, are doing things correctly. There are other folks, however, typically backed by various shady sectors of the financial industry, that really look at property and neighborhoods, and middle neighborhoods in particular. I must say, they really look at middle neighborhoods as their own private personal monopoly board. And they're not necessarily interested in all of the things that really qualify as a neighborhood. What they're interested in is maximizing profit. And they're going to do that by any means necessary. And that typically involves certain layers of legal protection, such as a triple shell LLC, real estate investment trust is a popular model. We're seeing increasingly that we've got issues with foreign capital being involved. Just all these kinds of ownership schemes that have the net effect of really just trying to squeeze every dollar of rent that they can out of the property until someone like Sally Martin comes along and says, oh my God, the floor is collapsing and this property needs to be condemned and put on our demolition list. And the folks who have been extracting the rent for maybe 5, maybe 10 years, they say, well, there's plenty of other fish in that sea. And they just move kind of like vultures from one neighborhood to the next, extracting all the wealth as conditions deteriorate because there's no effective way to hold them accountable. And some sunshine with regards to disclosures, local agents, right? I just mentioned triple shell LLCs, real estate investment trusts, and foreign capital. Many times there are folks that I deal with that have no idea who their landlord is, who their actual landlord is. There's some guy who comes around for rent he's a local agent, but he's not really, he doesn't have a real estate broker's license. He's just some guy. And that's a problem. That's a problem when things start to break down. And at least in Ohio, we do have a Landlord Tenant Act that does require the landlord to make some repairs. But if you don't know who your landlord is, it's very difficult to put your rent in escrow and trigger that case. So, I think the other thing, and I'm going to circle back with the limited time that I do have, to really discuss some specific things that I think might be for the Cleveland area. I mean, again, understanding the audience for this call, I don't necessarily want to get too far into the weeds of our particular ordinances and systems, because I understand that there is a great deal of difference between how City of Cleveland operates and how Philadelphia, for example, which is, I think, 4 or 5 times our size. You have there's different there's a different approach. But what I would say is that right now the emphasis really needs to be on modernization. It really does need to be on modernization and coordination, because while municipal code governs building and housing, right, ownership is typically done at the county level, right? It's the county that records the transfers of ownership between buyer and seller. It's the city, by and large, that's responsible for enforcement of maintenance requirements. So more coordination between those two sectors, I think, would really be valuable. And I also want to emphasize modernization in the sense of, I think I used a example previously where, there's a guy sitting on his yacht, he's got a laptop, and man, he's just pounding away there. He's got LLCs in all kinds of different states. He's online, he's buying and selling properties online without leaving the comforts of the harbor. Meanwhile, we've got severe under-resourcing of our building departments. And that is a problem when we're talking about this cat and mouse game. And particularly when we're talking about access to technology, understanding of how quickly properties can change hands in a digital marketplace, some real serious, time and attention needs to be placed on modernizing our code enforcement systems to understand this new reality that we're in. And also that there does need to be some additional coordination. And I think that flows right very well into recommendation number 4. I'm sorry if that was a lot in a very short amount of time, but I do have to get ready for court. I will put my contact information in chat if anyone wants to follow up directly. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. So I'm going to take over. It's Sally Martin, and I am the Director of Building and Housing for the City of Cleveland. Prior to that, I was the Housing Director for the City of South Euclid. So the cross-departmental and cross-governmental task force scenario really pivots into what Frank was describing as the Vacant Abandoned Property Action Council. And I know he didn't go into great detail, but I do want to just say a few more words about VAPAC generally. So since 2005, Frank has chaired this group, and people volunteer their time and they sit in a room or on a Zoom screen once a month and talk about issues affecting housing. And these are people from our county. These are people from the City of Cleveland. These are people from entering suburbs. These are people from the academic world, Case Western Reserve University, Cleveland State, to form a brain trust, so to speak, to talk through some housing policy issues. What can we do better? So I've had the privilege of being part of VAPAC since 2008. And by collaborating, we realize how much we can accomplish. And what we're suggesting here is that cities can do the same by bringing people from other departments together to strategize on ways to create better outcomes. And in the city of Cleveland, having been here since February, I can attest it's very easy for a large city to become siloed, and one department does not talk to another, and it leads to poor outcomes. And so some of the things that Zach was saying, you know, we all have to be aligned, and we need to be able to pivot very quickly because the situation on the ground is constantly changing. Investor activity is constantly changing, and we have to keep up with it. So the idea of creating a cross-governmental and cross-departmental task force is being done here in Cleveland. So we've started having meetings, and I think that a lot of people who've been in the city of Cleveland a long time seem to be shocked by this, you know, that I will invite Frank and Zach to a meeting. They don't work for the city of Cleveland, but we want to sit in a room. We want them there when we're talking through these things. And so we've started doing that, and it's been a game changer. Also leveling the playing field, ramping up efforts to make it easier for home buyers to compete with investor buyers. Well, what have we seen in the housing market? Home buyers have no ability to compete with investors. And I was a potential home buyer about a year ago when we had this run up in home prices, and I had made 22 offers, and none of them were accepted. So I lost out on every single house. And in one case, I bid $55,000 over asking, and an investor paid cash and had no contingencies and got the house. So what can we do, though, where we do have some ability to affect that? Well, down payment assistance is one thing that we certainly are considering in Cleveland with ARPA money to help. Home purchase counseling, if we have home buyer counseling agencies that are HUD approved, you know, we certainly want to keep them well funded so people are ready to purchase. And also we have worked here in Cleveland. We've created what we call the Greater Cleveland Reinvestment Coalition to work with lenders who have not been lending robustly to talk about how they can beef up lending and streamline loan processing to make buyers more successful. And also in Cleveland, there was a really interesting example of the Cincinnati port actually using their own funds to outbid investors to purchase 194 homes, which, you know, we're watching very carefully to see how that all works out for them. But one of the things that we're trying to do also in Cleveland is keep things off the demo list that can be rehabbed by also attempting to stand up some funds to help investors not have to go to hard money lenders. So we want to do lines of credit for small investors to be able to buy properties for cash, renovate them, have some gap funding in there to make the deal work so that we can create home ownership opportunities. And I think in some ways that's going to be an important role for municipal government to try to, where we can influence the housing market, where we can take things from tax foreclosure and get them repurposed or something on the demo list, and we can find gap funding to do that. That's a very important use of our money. And also what we're seeing constantly is that renters are very much at risk in this type of market. So where investors have come in and they're buying up properties, oftentimes these are already tenanted and the tenants are receiving notices saying their rent is going up exponentially, and there's nothing they can do. Often they don't have a lease, they have a month-to-month contract. So we're seeing tenants being displaced constantly in this market. So one of the things Cleveland has done recently is passed right to counsel and also pay to stay legislation. So right to counsel allows for people facing eviction to have the right to an attorney through Cleveland Legal Aid, which has been very, very helpful. And also we've enacted pay to stay legislation, and some of our neighboring communities have as well, which allows a tenant to remain in the unit if they're able to pay the rent that's due. So sometimes, well, in Ohio is one of only a few cities that allows a tenant to be evicted for being only one day late with rent, which we think is horrible. So we've been passing local laws to protect them. So we've made it an affirmative defense in an eviction hearing here in Cleveland. And it works very much in tandem with right to counsel. So we hope that that drives some better outcomes. We're also looking to pass a source of income legislation. Some other cities in Northeast Ohio have done so, which allows, you know, a tenant to not be discriminated based on the source of the rent. So if they're receiving public assistance or disability, a landlord can say, you know, they can't say we will not accept that form of payment. So also, you know, here in Cleveland, this is hyper local, but we had a wonderful organization for many years called the Cleveland Tenants Association, which was working, doing a lot of tenant organizing, helping tenants know their rights. And unfortunately, due to lack of funding, that organization was dissolved some years ago. And we've been desperate to get it back ever since. So certainly if you have one of those types of organization in your area, fight tooth and nail to save it, because I think right now we need it more than ever because tenants' rights are very much at risk. Next slide, please. So this, I will just keep talking because, and I'm speaking more of my experience working in the city of South Euclid, but just telling you what I saw on the ground. In South Euclid was very much a middle neighborhood and is a middle neighborhood, median home sale value under $200,000, pretty much demographics divided down the middle, half white, half black. A great first-time homebuyer community. Most of the homes look quite well maintained. But what we found during the foreclosure crisis, 30% of our housing stock had been in foreclosure. There was a lot of tax delinquencies. So it was a ripe market for investors to come in and swoop up lots and lots of parcels, which they did. And much like the quote earlier saying that the streets are paved in platinum, the streets in South Euclid surely were, because rents have been incredibly high forever, even when our home values plummeted during the crash. And you could pick up a 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath bungalow for $40,000 at the height of the crash. You were still getting $1,400 a month in rent. So of course, everyone was swooping in. And all of our residents were getting bombarded with offers to buy their homes for cash. And some of them did. And quite a few of them were built out of really what should have been their generational wealth to pass on to other generations, because, you know, they believed the investor. When the investor said, well, you better get out, the values are just going to go down, 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 and they sold their homes. And often this tenant displacement was something we saw every week. You know, people saying, well, you know, he said he's going to raise my rent by $300. What can I do? They would pack up and leave. And of course, these investors were not that interested in putting money into those houses. So we started to see an issue with code enforcement. South Euclid being a fairly small community, we had 9,600 housing units and about 23,000 residents, was quite easy to pivot and create some programs that really helped us combat some of that. One was what we called our vacant building ordinance that looked like a point of sale fundamentally. So if you were selling a vacant house in South Euclid or you owned a vacant house, you had to register it with the city. Before you could sell it, you would have to have a full interior and exterior inspection. And then before anyone could live in there, the house would have to be completely brought up to code and have a certificate of occupancy. So that helped us bring about 1,000 formerly vacant homes into productive use and, you know, back into full code compliance. So that's something that I'd love to emulate in Cleveland, but I'm finding with the 200,000 plus parcels we have in Cleveland, it's a little bit of a challenge. And I'm going to hand it over to Jamie, who was working in Cleveland's Old Brooklyn neighborhood, which is a quintessential middle neighborhood, to give a little bit more color commentary, because she was fighting the good fight for many years over there.
Thank you, Sally. Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear and see me over here. Yes, the Old Brooklyn neighborhood is the largest neighborhood in Cleveland. As Sally said, we're on the near west side. Historically, a white middle-class neighborhood. We currently have the fastest growing African-American and Hispanic populations. We still are 70% owner occupied, although that is quickly changing, especially depending on where in the neighborhood. What we're kind of seeing is a tale of two cities. So the neighborhood of Old Brooklyn overall in 2021 had like a 95,000 home resale or a median sales price, which for Cleveland is not so bad. And we have parts of the neighborhood where the investor activity is up to like 60 and 70% of streets are being bought up by these investors. We are looking at the home values in those streets and those census blocks being more like $50,000 to $70,000. And when you compare that to parts of our neighborhood where there's almost no investor buying activity at the strongest parts of our neighborhood, you're looking at home values in the 150 to 170,000 range. So it's not just impacting renters, which it definitely does. It's also impacting owners. So if you own your home in the South Hills part of Old Brooklyn, where there's almost no investor buyer activity, you have $150,000 value that you can play with to make improvements, get a home equity line. If you're in a part of the neighborhood where the home values are in the 50 to 70,000, you maybe can't get that new roof, you can't get the furnace, you can't make the improvements that you want to make, even just in another part of the Old Brooklyn neighborhood. And the other thing I'd point out as well, we in Cleveland, as Dr. Kobe pointed out, we are definitely mostly seeing a lot of the activity on the east side, which is predominantly minority. Old Brooklyn proves that this is not a them problem, it's not a their problem, it's all of our problem. It happens everywhere. So we are working to tackle this with the city of Cleveland. We are traditionally have worked with land banks. We've done over 70 home rehabs. We're continuing to track this and look forward to continued partnership. So thank you.
Frank, is that everything, or do you have some concluding?
No, I would like to switch to the last slide because both Jamie and I have a lot of comments about this.
Keep going.
Yeah, this Holton Wise is a real estate company in Cleveland that has some very dubious YouTube videos, which if you're interested later, you can look these up. It's pretty egregious, but they are one of the most aggressive cash buyers in our community. And I would say in South Euclid, we had a pretty decent strategy for managing this type of investor. You know, we were very good at holding local agents accountable for property condition in South Euclid, which is something I'm striving to do in Cleveland. So we ended up getting them to divest of their portfolio. But I know Jamie has a lot to say on Holton Wise because, oh my goodness, the battle is real here in Cleveland for people like this. Buying up everything they can get their hands on, and then actually going online and showing live eviction footage of them putting people out of their homes.
Yeah, I'll just add to that they're not actually most part buying the homes themselves. And, you know, you're not going to find Holton Wise owning hundreds of properties. They actually recruit out of town buyers who have no experience, who will use them to buy houses. Then they will turn around, and Holton Wise has an LLC that will do the home repairs, they'll do the leasing, they'll do the evictions. So they will get all the fees. So the last check I did, we had about 300 houses that were within the Holton Wise network with over 250 different owners. So just to track down if something's in Holton Wise, you have to almost drive down the street and look at the sign and see who owns it, and then kind of track backwards. So they're very hard to pin down by design. We are very much hoping that Sally is successful in giving us some more tools through the city of Cleveland to be able to do things like the South Euclid community did, because we have streets where it's literally a losing battle. We can't keep people off their computers and buying our houses. And yeah, they're just terrible, irresponsible, hard to track down ownership strategies.
So I'm going to hand it back to Frank if you'd like to take us with the wrap up, and then we wanted to leave plenty of time for questions today because we feel like everyone is going to have them. And I want to shout out to our friends from Jacksonville, Florida, which is my hometown, where I was born and raised. I see a couple people here, so hello.
You know, the couple things that come to my mind as I was listening, the one is at least in our market, the importance of holding people accountable for code enforcement and using code enforcement as a tool. So you probably could see that our recommendations probably were heavily weighted to that. And then also different ways to get greater disclosure to sort of pierce through these multiple layers. In fact, there's one thing, if we could go back If you could scan back through the slides for a minute, go back one more, stop there. No, one more. Recommendation number 2, the second bullet. This is sort of obscure and it wouldn't be clear what we're talking about. So let me take a minute to just explain it. I'm guessing that every jurisdiction in the country has some either department, it's either the county recorder, the county fiscal office, the county auditor. It's the place where you have to go if you're going to transfer property and file a deed. And our department requires people to fill out a form, and it's standardized, at least the basic format is standardized in Ohio counties, called the DTE 100. And it requires the parties to designate, the name of the seller, the name of the buyer, and some contact information, but it's not much. What I discovered in the Ohio Revised Code, and it's possible that other states have this language, there's a little paragraph where it says, but the county auditor may also require on this form any other information the auditor deems necessary. And I'm pretty sure that most auditors just ignore that. But what that opens the door for is, what if they were to require the names of the managers of LLCs, the email addresses, cell phone numbers? What if they were to go deeper? And I'm not sure, we'd have to give some thought to, what does that look like? So this is not something we have gotten Cuyahoga County to do yet, but it's something we thought we'd put in this presentation because you might want to do some exploration in your own community, look at your own state law. And what we could do, Marcia or Ann, if you remind me, I can send a citation to the Ohio Revised Code, and people could maybe look up what's the comparable section in their own state. It's very possible that counties throughout the country have some ability to be requiring more information than they do. And that could be very beneficial when you're trying to track down these people. So the only other thing in closing that I wanted to say, it's something that Tim said earlier that I didn't think of until he said it. When he was showing the dramatic increase on the east side of Cleveland, and that is, of course, a majority African-American community. And he said it wasn't cause and effect. And he's right, really. Our study can't say that we know that these investors are somehow targeting Black communities. And I don't think they are. I think it's all economical. But where there is a racial angle to cause and effect is if you go back 10 years, it was lenders who were doing predatory lending. They were targeting African-American communities for subprime, high-cost loans. And I think that while, it's not direct, but indirectly, the reason those prices are so low that attract these investors, or they're low because of all the foreclosures and the blight and the defaults that took place, and those were directly caused by predatory activity that did target African-American communities. So that's the only other thing I wanted to add. And I think we're at 1:09, so you've got plenty of time for questions.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, I think that last comment is really an important one. And I would just add, appraisal bias into the bin.
Yeah.
Anything that reduces values in Black neighborhoods just makes them bigger targets for investors.
Right.
Because, I've observed in any neighborhood I look at, if you analyze, what the ratio of investor purchases to owner occupant purchases are, the lower you go in the price range, the more investors are there. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of generally one of my reasons for arguing that we need to have strategies in neighborhood revitalization that are about getting values up to the point where they repel those bottom feeding investors and they deliver home equity to the owner occupants that we're trying to help buy there.
Right.
It's really important. And it's a piece of analysis I think that everyone should do to understand at what is that value point where you're overwhelmingly getting investors, because it can really help shape an idea about where you need values to get to. But everybody definitely drop your questions into the chat or the Q&A. I wonder if Sally, you could talk a little bit more about the Cincinnati's port example that you alluded to.
Thanks, Marsha. I see you did put something in chat about Cincinnati Port buying nearly 200 houses from an out-of-state landlord. I don't have a ton of context on it. I know that we were inviting them, or planning to invite them to VAPAC to speak with us. I don't know, Frank, did you have more to say about the port?
No, and you are correct, though, that we've been planning to do that, and it's on me. That's my fault that I haven't arranged it yet. So at this point, it's probably going to be the October meeting when we do that. So no, unfortunately, I don't have more detail on how did they do it, the mechanics of it. All I do remember, though, is that their intent was to acquire 194 rental units and convert them back to home ownership. So they were intentionally doing this to try to outbid investors to get these units so they could move them more towards home ownership.
I will say, toward that end, though, in the state of Ohio, at least, properties that go through tax foreclosure, or they're exposed to sheriff sale here, it's a judicial state. If they don't sell at 2 sheriff sale offerings, they default to what we call the state of Ohio forfeited lands inventory, which is advantageous for land banks and cities because we're able to pull those properties. So we saw some very interesting changes in the characteristics of properties that default to our state forfeiture list. Probably over the last 10 years, we started to see many more occupied properties in that inventory. We also saw many more structures than there used to be. In the past, it was usually vacant land or strips of vacant land that would end up in that status. But we had an opportunity here in Cleveland with a sale that was going to be held recently. There were about 900 parcels in that sale, and we were able to pull quite a lot of them in the city of Cleveland by also partnering with CDCs to try to find out what was in their area that they thought that they could renovate. Also, anything that we needed to demolish, we were pulling at all of our vacant land. So the strategy here in Cleveland is to try to control as much as real estate as possible and get it into beneficial hands so that we can create homeownership opportunities where the market is taking them away. So it's been a bit of a heavy lift here because it hasn't been done before. We were able to do that very well in South Euclid. It's a smaller community with more stable home values, but we were pulling everything we could get from the state of Ohio forfeited lands inventory, working with developers and creating home ownership opportunities, which we had done for about 10 years to great effect. So we also were talking to Rocket Community Fund here in Cleveland. They have a Make It Home program in Detroit where they're trying to take tenanted foreclosed properties and create home ownership opportunities. So we are our pilot cities, so we'll be doing that as well.
Yeah, it does seem like we've kind of, we're not in front of this issue, right? Who could have anticipated it? Probably a few people, but so there's this 2-pronged approach, it sounds like, in the strategies. One is, how do we correct the behavior of the bad landlords we have? How do we get the property out of their hands whenever we can? And then the other half of it is, how do we prevent this from happening? And in part, I think site control covers both of those areas. The kind of nonprofits that I work with and in city governments to some extent, they tend to have shied away from being in the business of acquisition and holding property because they see it as so high risk. But I'm not sure we can influence our way out of this problem without starting to get between the investors and the properties. What do you guys think about that? Should, or maybe a more direct question is, should we all be gearing up our tolerance for risk and be in the acquisition business. Just helping a home buyer be ready to buy doesn't solve the problem of them being outbid by a cash investor. So what do we do about that?
There was a bill in the Ohio House, or was it the Senate, Frank? Senator Blessing, I guess it was in the Senate,
Yeah,
attempting to give home buyers a first look at anything coming through a public auction.
Yeah.
So we need to do more things like that as well to really give people a fighting chance to be able to get control. And certainly we are having to be a little bit more, or I should say less risk adverse with city government in terms of taking a chance on holding these properties. And I would say it was a big lift for us in Cleveland to do that. But we had the backing of the mayor, and I think, other cities need to look at avenues like that as well.
So we had a couple of questions in the Q&A. Will we send the PowerPoint? Yes, we will. We'll do a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this webinar that has a link to the recorded webinar, and assuming that we get the okay from our panelists, also to the PowerPoint presentation, so that you could use some of those slides to talk about the issue and to set up, your local conversations. Kimberly has talking about middle neighborhoods in general. What are some first steps that neighborhood alliances should undertake? And what are some steps that cities should undertake to help stabilize neighborhoods? It just seems so massive. Yeah. Kimberly, where are you from? If you want to type that into the chat, that may help a little bit. If you're looking at middle neighborhoods in general, we have Lake Charles, Louisiana. I don't have any particular relationships in Lake Charles, but I would say in middle neighborhoods in general, at our website, we have a mapping tool that can be a great way to start a conversation to at least figure out where your middle neighborhoods are, and to start looking at some basic market analysis I always like to do to understand what the trends are in those places. So look at what the trends have been on owner occupancy over time. Is it declining or isn't it? How many census tracts do you have that have a median household income that fits whatever your definition of middle is, and how has that changed over time? We've got maps of so many cities where it's astonishing how middle neighborhoods have disappeared. And so I think it's the trend. It's always the trend is what we need to understand about them. And then you can start to get in front of just assembling the people who are experts in all the different angles on this, just the way that Sally was talking about for this issue of investors and vacant properties, so that you can get a lot of different minds and angles on where to start first and how to work through whatever the nonprofits may be in your community, the cities, start to talk to similar cities and see what they're doing. And for sure, just, get in contact with me after this, and I'd be happy to talk more about that. I had a couple of other thoughts here while we're waiting for more questions. Oh, just one that I've learned from some practitioners lately, that really being aggressive about offering rehab lending options to existing owner occupants in neighborhoods that are at risk for this investor purchase issue can be one plank in a strategy that's about, reducing people's inclination to sell to an investor. So in other words, I talked to a practitioner in South Shore in Chicago, and they learned that investors were just door knocking for elderly homeowners. And basically the message was, we know you're overwhelmed by your roof leaking and all of this. Why don't you just sell it to me and we'll take it off your hands and you won't have to think about it anymore. So when people are faced with those rehab issues, it can really be a motivating factor to sell.
Marcia, can I add one thing to that? One
Please.
thing that we have been seeing in Old Brooklyn is not just elderly people, but they are attracting probate court.
Ooh.
And they're targeting people who have inherited property.
Yep.
and or are inheriting property. So if you're the daughter or the niece or the nephew and you don't know what to do with this house, they'll take it right off your hand.
That's right. That's such a good point. Such a good point, Jamie. The whole world of heir property is like, if you are not familiar with it already, there's like a whole set of our counterparts that are working right next to us in that field and trying to intervene in these transfers of property and make it possible for families to keep the assets that are being passed through the family, but also these are the risk points that we really need to be prepared to offer people assistance for, like before they hear from the investors. They need to know. I've a couple of neighborhoods I've been familiar with, they're really trying to get in front of that with not only the owners, but their family members about letting them know what their options are in the future. We have a question here from Michael. There's a revenue stream here for investors. Dr. Kobe mentioned not pulling permits and making subpar repairs. What other aspects of the real estate process, from purchase to rehab to holding as a rental or flipping, are investors cutting corners on to save money and make that profit? Marcia asked the question I think a lot of public entities are afraid to address, as the public sector needs to take a more active role in acquisition, rehab, or facilitating that process through CDCs, et cetera. But if the private sector can make a profit, can the nonprofit sector make a profit in this process too? What do you think, guys?
One thing that comes to my mind about why the nonprofit sector often can't make the same profit as for-profit investors is that, of course, I think for most of us, the colleagues we have in the nonprofit sector are motivated to be doing sustainable work. In other words, there's a furnace in the house. Let's just take this example. There's a furnace in the house that's 15 years old, maybe 20 years old. It works today. It's actually working. But most nonprofit CDCs and developers I know would say, we're not going to take that risk. We're putting a new furnace in. We don't want to sell a home to somebody and then they risk that a year from now they've got a $1,500, $2,000 expense. The for-profit investor is more likely to say, it's working today, I'm leaving it in. So I think it is hard for the nonprofit sector, if it is as well-intentioned as I think most of us believe it is, to compete with investors whose business model does not include doing that kind of sustainable work. And again, I'll say, of course, there are responsible investors who do want to do that work, but
Yeah,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would say that's true. In South Euclid's example, our Community Development Corporation, One South Euclid, contracted with developers, but we insisted on the scope of work. We ensured that all of the permits were being pulled. And so a CDC can also work with a private developer and ensure that the scope of work is what it needs to be. And I noticed there was a question in the chat about, is anyone using ARPA money in this way to kind of help facilitate this? And that the answer is yes. In Cleveland, we're proposing $50 million of ARPA to be used for housing projects and gap funding for projects where the private sector wouldn't be able to make a profit if they were to rehab a property properly in certain markets. So we're proposing $35 million of gap to help with those sorts of scenarios. And also $5 million, which I think we're going to try to be leveraging with banks to do a line of credit for developers for acquisition rehab, to work in those neighborhoods and be able to buy them, or a CDC, not just a private developer. So we're hoping to foster more of that, and also $10 million of home repair funding as well.
Yeah. Kimberly, I noticed there's been an exchange between you and Michael about your attempt to convey to city officials how the decline in the value of middle neighborhoods is going to impact financial stability for the city. I just wanted to share that for the city of Des Moines, Iowa, they basically, their city manager and treasurer were helped to see with a consultant team that if they projected out the city's real estate tax revenue from middle neighborhoods for the next 20 years, given the trends in home values, that they were going to have a hard time fixing potholes in 20 years if they didn't do something to correct this. And they took that so seriously that they created a new nonprofit just to invest in middle neighborhoods to try and stabilize and increase property values and make those neighborhoods sort of be able to compete again for middle households that they were losing to the suburbs. And they capitalized it in an extraordinary way using sales tax revenue. And it's now getting funding of $10 million a year that is mostly going out in grants with no income limits to help nonprofits, private homeowners, investor developers, rehab properties to meet certain standards that they set that are going to be the kinds of rehab things, the improvements and updates that are going to bring those values up and are going to be attractive to home buyers. So they're really intervening in the market in a big way. And all of that is really driven by their desire to look out for their long-term financial future and the city's ability to continue to offer quality services to the whole community. And also, I might add, even the county has been helping to fund this program. Okay, David Sand from Remind Me David in the chat. Many nonprofits are renovating for home ownership versus many investors who put in a minimal amount. Yeah, that's really an issue. I wonder. St. Ambrose, thank you, in Baltimore. Yeah, that's an issue. You know, one thing that Sally mentioned when she was covering some of the recommendations that caught my eye, there was one in there that had something to do with doing away with some kind of a requirement of renters in order to get into rental properties. I can't remember now what it was. Maybe we could go back to that second slide of recommendations, but it just made me, it sparked this thing in my mind, which I've observed expand enact source of income legislation. I think that's what I was thinking of. But you know, one of the things I've observed is that any of these rules that we allow landlords to put on renters has the perhaps unintended consequence of creating a market of bad landlords who can exploit the renters who don't meet those requirements, right? So it's like the ban the box thing, legislation that some cities have done or are trying to do, where you can't take into account criminal background in renting. I think it's something we really need to think about. It's another contributor to making it possible for these landlords to charge incredible rents and exploit the lack of choices that some renters have. Okay, so it's 10:29. I think that we'll wrap it up. As I said, we'll send a follow-up email. We'll have links to all the relevant resources that we talked about in this webinar. We encourage you to come to our website. At the bottom of any page, you can join our community of practice. That's middleneighborhoods.org. And I hope that you all learned something today. I certainly learned a lot from our panelists. I want to thank you guys so much. You've really shouldered a huge amount of work for people across the country and given us a place to launch from, to do that work in our own local communities. It was really, really interesting, and I really appreciate it. So coming up next, we have an engagement chat. We do these once a month for people who are involved in community engagement. We're going to focus this one on strategies for the holidays. And we also always like to call out our partner Center for Community Progress and their wonderful webinar series, the Cornerstone webinar series. Rob was on our call today. Always check it out. We love to hear your ideas for other webinars, for case studies, news stories, etc. We'll have some an evaluation feedback thing at the end of this. And just appreciate all of you taking the time to be with us today. Thanks again to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. See you.